Hello everyone, welcome to Cruising Through History, a bit of a special edition. I bet you weren't expecting to hear from us this week again. So we've got a special episode of Cruising Through History today, because in Kenosha and Wisconsin in general, I suppose,
yes.
we have an election. We have elections going on.
Yep,
we had our spring primary in February, spring election April 5th, fall primary, and then fall general 2022 coming up. And so we kind of wanted to talk about voting, and we couldn't fit into our regular schedule, so we were like, you know what, let's just sit down again and talk about voting.
And who gets to vote?
Yeah, this is all about who gets to vote. That's a thing that Kenosha Public Library is putting together, is this whole series of programs and events about who gets to vote, the history of voting, how voting has become what it is today.
Right.
And we've decided to join and be part of that.
Right.
And so, as usual, Scott has done a whole bunch of research
about voting. Some research.
Some research. Meanwhile, I was like, I may have over-prepared, and I have done absolutely none. So we're going to go, and Scott, go ahead and where are we starting with voting?
We're going to start with, since we're talking about who gets to vote, I wanted to kind of start with how we got from the beginning to now. And so most of the colonial charters in colonial America, of course, it was white property holding landowners, I guess that's redundant, but who could vote. And by the time of the 1790s, when they do the Constitution, some states are changing that a little, but it's still landowners that can vote. And the problem is the Constitution, it never really, at the beginning, it didn't specifically spell out who could vote. They kind of left that to the states.
Yeah, and it's, when you say landowners too, what could like women own land, or was it just always?
Well, I was thinking about this because they could, and there were some state constitutions when they would write laws about land would refer to her or him in their language, but as we know, a lot of women didn't vote. I mean, in fact, the only woman that, in the colonial era, the only woman that's known to have voted was somebody named Lydia Taft. And she was allowed to vote in town hall meetings in Massachusetts in 1756. But no one's ever found any other woman that was able to vote.
Wow.
And so what happened where the change comes is the 1790s come, and a lot of state constitutions have, it's more like gender and race. So they started to disenfranchise more people. But what happens is, it's almost a weird thing. As we go through the 19th century, the property holding stuff starts to go away.
Okay.
In fact, the 1828 presidential election was the first one in which non-property holding white males could vote.
Okay, but it was still
white
males.
Yes, in a majority of states. Some states, even though they didn't have the property owning facet of it, you had to pay a certain tax.
To vote?
Which we'll get to in a little bit, because that'll rear its ugly head after the Civil War and during Reconstruction.
Oh boy.
And so, and it doesn't surprise me, 1828 was the election of Andrew Jackson. And when we think of Jacksonian America, we think of this period when he was president, and a little later, antebellum America. It's kind of thought of as a populist time, and it does make sense that, and the 1840 presidential election had like an 80% turnout. There were like 2 million ballots cast, which is, I mean, I don't even know if the population, well, I'm sure the population was over 2 million, because that wouldn't have worked. The math wouldn't have worked. But the funny thing about the 1840 presidential election was, it was William Henry Harrison versus, and John Tyler, so it was the Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which most people know. And it was also called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider. And what they did is they sort of painted Martin Van Buren, who was the opponent, as this sort of wealthy aristocrat, you know. And I mean, we still hear echoes of this in elections today.
Oh yeah, they probably think politicians like aim to be like, I'm the people's
politician. And that's
this person's a rich.
And that's why Jackson had such appeal. And the funny thing about the William Henry Harrison deal is, he had this appeal as, I live in a log cabin. He did when he was in the West. Now, he was actually from a wealthy planter family in Virginia. And it was Martin Van Buren who came from, his dad was like a tavern keeper in New York. So they had flipped the script a little there. And so there was this, I think there was this notion, and it didn't, and I'll talk about why it didn't apply in every state, because there was this thing I ran across. I never knew this happened.
Okay.
In the 1841 and 1842, there was something called the Dorr Rebellion in the state of Rhode Island. So this tells you that people are, well, I always have to mention that the states were different. A lot of states did abolish a lot of these things. Some states still didn't. The problem with Rhode Island is it was using its original colonial charter from the 17th century. I think it was 1663 as their constitution, which meant only large landowners could vote.
Oh dear.
And so it was fine when it was mostly agricultural. But the state, during the Industrial Revolution, which also happens during this time, a lot of people move from the country to the city. They don't have land, but they still can't vote because they're using this antiquated charter. So a man named Thomas Wilson Dorr decides to do something about it. So they actually come up with their own constitution, and there's sort of this parallel government that's running at the same time the regular government's running.
How in the world does that work out? Like, how does that even
Well,
work?
it ended badly for Dorr.
Okay.
Because apparently they got fed up with trying it this way, so they thought they'd raid the arsenal or something. And then the military, the authorities called out the military and crushed the thing. So I never knew that happened. When I saw this, I went, Dorr Rebellion, that's interesting. So, but what happened was Rhode Island, because of all this, rewrote their constitution and made their voting rules, still for white males, but they made them broader.
But so even then, who could vote was a big enough deal that they tried to set up like a proxy government.
Right. I mean, when you allowed non-property holders, that's when everyone sort of got into this. I mean, we think that's the one thing when I think about the 19th century, and I know if you've listened to any of our other podcasts, I've covered the 19th century at length in some of them because it's a very interesting period to me. And but I mean, when we did one on the Shakespeare riots, there was a lot of class issues in that one too, and that was 1849. So this is right in that wheelhouse. And so, but what really the Civil War is what starts to expand the voting rights.
Okay, why was I mean, of course, Civil War, we get to the end of slavery, so we're gonna have potentially more U.S. citizens in general from that. But why exactly did the Civil War
I should say
there?
it was more Reconstruction.
Okay.
Reconstruction laws made African American citizens, and so they were given the right to vote in some places, but with a lot of conditions on. But there was an amendment in 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, that says you can't be denied or abridged based on your race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which of course they threw that in there because...
If you were a slave before...
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there was that, and there was an attempt, and it didn't work at first. It took a while, but during the Grant's presidency, during Reconstruction, there were federal troops in the South to ensure that the newly, I should say freedmen because it wasn't women, got their chance to vote. And this is when you saw the proliferation of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who thought, no, not going to have that.
So they saw there's that amendment, and then people were citizens, and then they tried to vote, and then they're like, wait, we don't want them to vote.
Right.
That's kind of how it went.
And I think they said, okay, well, you can have an amendment, but you know how we'll get around it? Because the states still, states have control. We'll put in things like poll taxes. Remember I mentioned taxes previously.
Yep.
We'll put poll taxes in, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, all these crazy things. And so, of course, not only does it disenfranchise a lot of African Americans, it disenfranchises a lot of poor whites too, because they can't pay the poll tax. A lot of them are illiterate; they can't do it. So yeah, it was, and it really the Ku Klux Klan was actually the U.S. government did work to successfully disband the Ku Klux Klan in the late 1860s, but by the mid 1870s, other groups had sprung up to take their place, and I think it's really kind of the whole 1876 election, which was. I mean, we talk about elections now, but in 1876, I mean, there was an estimate that 150 African Americans were murdered in North Carolina during that, and that's just North Carolina. I mean, there were gunfights in the streets in cities and towns in the South and places like that. So, yeah, and the country was getting sort of fed up with the whole thing, and so when the 1876 election was so close between Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, that ended Reconstruction. And so all the federal troops were pulled out of the South, which meant that a lot of state legislatures started to change. At the time, more Democrats were voted to them, and they weren't in sympathy with what was happening. And this is where you get the Jim Crow laws that lasted for about, officially, I don't know if there's an official end date, but probably about 100 years at least.
Because, I mean, when we go in the 1960s protests, they're like talking about let's end Jim Crow. So 100 plus years, 100 really.
Plus, yep.
I'm betting, and forgive me, I haven't looked it up specifically. There's probably some things that are still in the books but not enforced, like all of them.
Probably.
Yeah.
And there's been 4 amendments to the Constitution since the Civil War. And there's 4 of them that deal with voting. Mm-hmm. And so the next one was, which I'm sure we'll get to, it was you couldn't deny someone on account of their sex. That was the 19th Amendment. That was 1920. But the amendment that ended the poll taxing by reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax, that wasn't passed till 1964. That was the 24th Amendment.
Wow.
So that went on, and you had intimidation all over the place. And then, of course, the 18-year-olds got the vote in 1971. That was the 26th Amendment.
What was it before that?
21, I think.
Okay.
I've always known it as 18, so. But I think it was 21. But what changed that was the Vietnam War. And people saying, well, if I'm 18 and go to a war, why can't I vote?
Yeah.
Or drink. Well, they could drink then.
So I think what's getting me at this is people, like everyone's recognizing the power of voting at this in these junctures. Reconstruction, or Reconstruction even beforehand when land ownership was less an issue. You got that 80% voter turnout, which if that happened today, could you imagine like the headlines, 80% of US citizens voting today? But there's kind of this wrestling of control of we don't want certain people to vote.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's kind of a long, tortured history, but it does expand. I mean, the franchise does expand as we go down the road here. Yes, it wasn't perfect. There were plenty of false starts and plenty of crazy things that went on, and tragic things that went on too. It does expand.
Yeah.
And you look in the civil rights movement. You brought that up. I mean, their whole thing was we want to vote. Just like you do.
Yeah. As much as nonviolent protests or civil disobedience was part of the whole campaign, I actually remember I didn't prepare for this, but I've been reading more about John Lewis and King. Mm-hmm. Half of it was those nonviolent protests. The other half was getting people to register and go out to vote.
Because really, what marks you? I mean, you see this today even when people go to naturalization ceremony. What marks you as a citizen? You get to vote, and that's an important thing for a lot of people. Yeah,
people still celebrate. For new citizens, they are still like, this is my first time voting, and that is a big deal.
Yes.
So there's almost like, historically at least, no time where people didn't recognize the power in voting itself, either through trying to restrict other people from voting, or kind of just being like, there's no restrictions, or intimidating them, or adding extra needs, even money for people to vote.
And even when you see reforms in the late 19th century because of the machine politics going on, well, that goes in the 20th century too. One of the biggest complaints for the reformers was, you're sort of sullying this vote. You're paying people to vote for certain ways because they knew it was an important thing. Mm-hmm. And even that's couched in that kind of language, and that in some sense. But yeah, I always think of, there's a scene, I know I've mentioned this like 3 times. If you're a regular listener, you know I've mentioned this. So there's a scene in the movie The Gangs of New York, which I just find a great movie for the 19th century. But anyway, so they get a bunch of guys, they're like in a flop house or something. Okay, gentlemen, voting day. So they run them down. Then they take them to a barber. They get their hair cut and they shave their beards off and then run them back to the same polling place. But I think that's what got under the skin of a lot of people. That this is a thing that people, this is an important right, and yet you're kind of sullying it. But it still happens. So
yeah, well, voter fraud as a whole is, it's 2022. We had the 2020 election just a while ago, and people talk about voting fraud as a huge issue.
Right.
And ways that, what votes count, what votes don't count.
Right, and we see, and I was thinking about this when I was thinking about sort of the historical part of this. I was thinking about when we hear arguments today, they almost echo a lot of these things, and it's almost like which side, who gets to vote for us? I mean, it's weird. I don't know if I'm putting it in the right words, but these things echo. And it comes down to the same thing sometimes.
Yeah, so. It's a little bit of that history repeats itself in different ways. That you'll hear an argument that sounds surprisingly familiar to something from 1920, or you'll hear the same words. Like I remember when we talked about the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, the Black Death, and we talked about some of that sounds similar to what COVID stuff.
Yes.
It was very similar that we were just like, huh.
Now, but the only thing that was missing, we didn't have the flagellants running through the streets whipping themselves on the back, or people wearing hair shirts. But you
got a point there. And so, when we're getting past Reconstruction, let's go. We're going in like 1890s, 1900s. How from there did voting shift? We know we got the 19th Amendment in 1920.
Yes.
We celebrated 100 years of that 2 years ago.
Right.
But how did it go from Reconstruction to that point?
Well, in the southern states, it didn't go very well because that's when they employed a lot of those. But actually, the whole impetus behind the 19th Amendment, that started in like the 1870s. Like I know that suffragists would go vote. Of course, they would be stopped from voting, and they were hoping the Supreme Court would help them out here by making sort of a test case. Like, I'm going to try to vote. We don't get to vote, and so now it's going to get thrown. We're going to sue.
Oh yeah.
And so this started, and it was a very slow, as you can tell. It was because it didn't happen in 1920. It was a very slow roll. But I think with Susan B. Anthony, she did vote in 1872, but she was later arrested for it and found guilty. But this brought a lot of attention to the cause for women's suffrage.
What was she found guilty of?
I don't know. I guess attempting. I found this weird when I read it because I kept going. But if it was illegal, they wouldn't have let her vote in the first place. So I don't know if someone was in cahoots and let her vote. I don't know that story. I think there's so many good books on the suffragist movement out there that those will probably answer all these questions. But I was kind of confused too by that. But and so that starts a slow roll. And in Great Britain, we're talking about America, of course, but in Great Britain, the suffragist movement, and a lot of them, I'm picturing people, breaking windows and stuff, and maybe you have to, but I have that picture in my mind. But so that started that, and there were 2 organizations that were they were sort of running parallel to each other for women's suffrage, and I think one was they were more looking for doing it within the Constitution, and other ones were looking for amendments to the Constitution, and I think later they merged. So, but I think it was because of the Reconstruction and the 19th Amendment, where it's like, well, we're expanding the franchise. Why can't we get it too?
Yeah.
So all these groups are starting to sort of come out, and that's why I think between there and there, that's why I think it broadened.
Well, because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe black men could vote before.
Yes.
Yeah. So black men could vote, but white women couldn't vote.
Right. Even after the Civil War, it was freed men, and they could. Well, they could vote for a while.
And until Jim Crow, all those extra
Right, because
things.
you did have some, in Mississippi and places like that, you did have blacks who went to the Congress that were voted. But yeah, it didn't last very long, unfortunately. And so once the Jim Crow laws were kicked in, that's what made it so hard. And like I said, then you go but then you have this other event happen in the 20th century, which we talked about a little when we were talking about the integration of professional football, World War II.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there were a lot of African American soldiers, veterans, who came back and said, well, why was I fighting Hitler and I come home and I can't even ride a bus? Mm-hmm. That, I think, and then you get these little events that happen, but they all add up to a big thing. You have you have Rosa Parks.
Yep.
You have Emmett Till's murder, which was,
Yep.
In fact, I was just talking to someone about Emmett Till yesterday so you have that happen. And these are things that are happening in the 50s. Martin Luther King is starting to come. So you're starting to have these things happen. And I think when you get into the 60s, that's when it kind of goes, it all kind of rolls into the 60s. And then the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which basically was passed to ensure that some of these constitutional amendments were being enforced. Mm-hmm. You can't say, I can't deny you your ability to vote based on your race, and then say, well, we'll get by that by just passing a bunch of things where we'll make it impossible, even though we're not technically stopping you, mm-hmm. but you can't pay the poll tax, so Zander, you can't vote.
Yeah.
And that's all gone.
Then, making sure there's enforcement of that too. Not just like, we put it in there, but we got to enforce it.
And that's what happened after Reconstruction. They enforced it, and then when they pulled the reinforcement, people thought, okay, well, we can just go around it now because there's no one's going to enforce it. And the Supreme Court wasn't much help in the 19th century, so what do?
Yeah. To me, it's incredible the amount of effort that has been put into disenfranchising voting in some way, shape, or form. Because when I'd said there's recognition of the power of voting, it wasn't necessarily that the people voting recognized that the power of voting. It's people that didn't want other people to vote recognize the power of voting. Because like you said, right after the Civil War, some black folks got put into offices, and then they were like, wait a minute,
Then it ended.
Let's not let that happen. Let's not have that change happen. It always seems that things with voting become contested when there are big changes afoot.
Yes.
And then people start noticing voting more.
Right, and you see it, you talk about the power that was put in to disenfranchise people. Think of all the effort and everything to come up with these things. But then think of some of the people who basically paid for their lives for trying to register. Those 3 civil rights workers that were murdered in the early 60s.
Yes.
Schwerin, and I can't remember the other 2 names, unfortunately.
I had read about them because they were missing for so long.
And when the Freedom Riders went down to the South, they were registering people to vote. And for the African Americans who did register, that was to me a brave act, because I don't know if I would have done it.
Well, it wasn't just that could be, if they went to register or they went to vote, they would have their names published.
Yep.
When they registered in the newspaper. So people could then harass them, or they could be fired from their jobs, or something else like that.
And so a lot of people are probably just, I don't want the problem. Mm-hmm. You can keep my vote. And I can't blame them. If someone's going to come to your house in the middle of the night and burn it down, I think I might be I may be frightened to do it. So yeah, it's these two opposite ends. You have one, all the effort, like you said, putting in disenfranchisement, and but people actually risking, paying for it with their lives to do that stuff. That was one of the, and again, we talk about the importance of voting. That was one of the biggest things. Register people to vote.
Yeah.
That was the biggest thing.
It's kind of incredible. When we talk about voting, and people often talk a lot about the big election, the presidential election every 4 years. That's the big one. Mm-hmm. But it's also the local elections, because a lot of the times for registering to vote, it wasn't presidential elections that were 4 years. It was,
Right.
city council seats. It was governor elections. It was even Senate elections every 2 years. It's all of those that are also just as important, even more so, because each individual has more power at that level.
Right, and in the South it was really important because, the state ran it, but even on the local level, they would run their own elections too.
And think of the population of people of color in the South compared to
Right.
the white populations. You can see why there is a lot of attempts to disenfranchise because there were more.
Well, there was a quote I was reading from I think he was a congressman from North Carolina or South Carolina in the late 19th century. And he basically said what you just said. He said, well, there's 135,000 of us and there's 200,000 Negroes in this state. Do we want them voting? I mean, they were so honest about it. I mean, it's like, okay. I mean, to our ears, it's like nails, nails on a chalkboard. But for them, but you're right. In fact, Americans were a majority in 3 southern states. And 40% of the population in 4 other states were African American.
I mean, it seems, and I hate to say it this way, it seems logical. Like the attempt, if you're going to let everyone vote and you have, say, 80% turnout, well, that's going
and
to
I think
be
that's that
difficult.
point that congressman was making. A logical argument. Nothing, he never said anything hateful. I mean, in a sense. I mean, it's almost it's almost when you think of it like, no, that's. But his argument was, well, we're a minority, so we're going to try to. Okay, I don't know how else to put it. I'm not trying to offend anybody. But,
Yeah, well,
but you're right. Yeah,
it's kind of numbers have. I mean, we talk about U.S. government. The people have the power. I mean, the more people that are there that have the power, depending on what way they want to vote,
Right.
that's how it turns out. I think in today's ways, we think of limitations to voting as things like district redistricting, how districts are
Right,
going,
right.
or redlining as huge issues, but those really divide out the people in certain areas to vote other ways.
and there are
different ways.
some things that states can still do, like not have felons vote. I mean,
yeah.
they can still do that. That's legal. There's nothing in anything that says it's not. So there's still ways. It's not as extreme as, killing people in the streets.
Yeah.
But there's still ways states can do it. But you can't violate these constitutional amendments, though. That's the trick.
Yeah. And
Well,
nowadays,
it's not really a trick. But.
I think this is me as a librarian getting to talk at this point, which I rarely get to do on this show.
I'm a librarian too.
Yeah. Though really, nowadays you think it's the information and how that's distributed to people.
Right.
So much is online. I even remember the spring primary. There is a lot going on amongst the spring primary in Wisconsin as a whole when it came to absentee voting and where you can turn in
Right.
ballots, because that was at first it was going to be a thing, and it was challenged in a court that said nope, no more, you can't use drop boxes.
Right. Right.
And then that was appealed to, and then it was like, okay, you could use them, and then that was then brought to Wisconsin Supreme Court, and they were like, I think it was only one vote made it so that for the spring primary you could use the election. But who knew that? Like, if you didn't know
Right.
that,
Right.
if you didn't get that information,
Right.
there could have been a lot of votes that just didn't happen because of
And unfortunately, now that we live in an age of social media and whatnot, you can put a lot of information that's incorrect out into the world. And,
Yeah.
And people will see it, and if they don't have any other recourse, they'll think it's true. So
it is very interesting how that there are different ways of controlling votes nowadays, and it's interesting. You don't control the people directly, but it's like the information around it.
Right.
Do you need to re-register? Do you need to what type of ID do you need? All that
Right.
info. There's so much info out there, but which
Right.
ones are right? Which ones are there?
exactly.
And so for anyone who is listening, I mean, it's an election year, but even for future years,
listen to this in about 10 years.
Yeah, 10 years from now, listen back to this. Voting historically has power.
Yes.
And so
it's why I think people still get it causes so much hoo-ha, if you will.
Yeah, every few years, every
Right.
time.
Right.
So, just kind of register, see what you need to do.
Right.
I will bet your local library will help you with
Yes.
registering and
Yes.
figuring out what documents you need to register or be there at the polling
Right.
place.
Exactly.
Or your library is a polling place, depending on how the districts work out.
Right.
So yeah, feel free to
And if
register.
you're, one thing I learned as a voter for all these years is that even if your candidate loses, keep voting.
Yep.
Don't stop. That's just how it works in our system. Somebody wins, someone loses.
Yep.
So.
And so, yeah, feel free, register. We've got our elections April 5th. So that's our next one. And I hope you are able to enjoy any more of the Who Gets to Vote content that's going out. You can check all of that out from our website. And
Yes.
I say our not this podcast website, from our library's website.
Right.
That's mykpl.info.
Very
And
good.
you can feel free to follow any more of the Who Gets to Vote content. Oh, hey, Scott, did you know that listeners can actually contact us now?
They can. How can they do that?
Yeah, they can just email us at historycruise@mykpl.info.
Great. Also, like and subscribe on any of the platforms you find this podcast.